Welcome to this lecture. This is about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, and I've titled this Sodom Wasn't About Sodomy, the Proof from the Bible and Historical Sources. My name is Rob Pinion, and I appreciate your watching this. There should exist here a trigger warning related to sexual assault, etc. And some people may not want, at least now, to hear about sexual abuse. The Bible passages we will be reading describe sexual and physical abuse in detail enough to require trigger warning to be issued. Please judge whether you and those within earshot are appropriate listeners of the content before proceeding. The subject matter is not suitable for children. How to approach this lecture. By the way, I should say I know that I could run this in slideshow mode, but my recording won't pick up the movement between slides if I do that, so just bear with me, and maybe you can zoom in if you need to. How to approach this lecture. Take your time. You don't have to finish it all in one session. You can start and stop it as many times as you need. Maybe you want to listen to it in about 15-minute segments. It's going to be about an hour long. You can look after it's recorded, of course, at your playback bar to see exactly how long it is. Read and reread the Bible passages as necessary, particularly if you're not very familiar with them, and there are probably some you won't be familiar with. Leave your preconceived notions at the door and be open to changing your mind. At the end of this, you don't have to agree with me, but you might find some things that might make you think about these passages a little differently. In this lesson, we will learn how there is almost no way the story of Sodom and Gomorrah has to do with sodomy, another term used for homosexuality, even despite the name that has been applied to the term. We will learn this in several ways: through the story of Sodom itself, in the book of Judges, the story of the Levite and his unnamed concubine. They're actually both unnamed, but he's called the Levite, and the horrific things that happened to them in the town of Gibeah. By comparing the two stories above, by considering other scriptures that mention Sodom, and by looking at some historical commentary. Some questions to consider. If the stories of Sodom and Gomorrah and the story of Gibeah do not have to do with homosexuality, then what exactly do they have to do with? So we'll think about that as we go along. Did the people in the past treat them as having to do with homosexuality? If not, when did the reinterpretation happen? Obviously, I'm saying that a reinterpretation occurred. And why do people these days interpret the stories as having to do with homosexuality? All right, part one of this lecture is a synopsis of Sodom, the story of Sodom, that is. There are several mentions of Sodom before the famous story of its destruction, and we will look at those and then look at the famous story in more detail. You will probably see some things in the story you haven't thought about before. There's a typo there. And I encourage you to have an open mind to consider new insights. If someone has asked you to watch this video, then that means they want you to consider the contents. Be thankful that someone cares for you in that way. All right, we're going to summarize now what happened in Genesis 13. In that case, Abram and Lot go their separate ways. And the scripture says Abram gave, this was before he was called Abraham, Abram gave Lot the choice of where to go. Lot was Abram's nephew, and their shepherds, their workers, were fighting, and so they decided to split ways. And Lot pitched his tents near the city of Sodom, which was one of the cities of the plain. In Genesis 13:13 says, "Now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord." It doesn't say how, but it says they were doing that. Then in chapter 14, Sodom is a war ally but is rescued by Abram and his forces, or his workers. So Sodom's soldiers fall into a tar pit, interestingly enough, and Lot himself is taken away by the enemy, but Abram rescues Lot and conquers those groups that had taken Lot away. So then the king of Sodom said to Abram, "Give me the people and keep the goods for yourself." That would be the spoils of war. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, quote, "With raised hand I have sworn an oath to the Lord God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, that I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or a strap of a sandal, so that you will never be able to say, 'I made Abram rich.' I will accept nothing but what my men have eaten and the share that belongs to the men who went with me." So it's interesting in that Abram must have learned that God considered Sodom evil, or maybe Abram considered Sodom evil, but he wasn't going to have anything to do with being dependent upon the king there. Now, fast forward to Genesis 18. There's some stories that are in between that are important, and Abram is now Abraham. Genesis 18, God decides to destroy Sodom. So starting in verse 16, Abram pleads with God for Sodom, but God says he would not destroy Sodom if at least 10 righteous men were found there. You might be familiar with the story, and you can go and read it if you want to. It's really inconsequential as far as what we're about to read, but it's where Abram lists numbers in descending order until he gets to 10, and God pledges each time he will not destroy Sodom if at least that many people are in the city. And to get down to 10, Abram doesn't take any to a smaller number than that. So in Genesis 19 is where we have this, we can call it the sex scene. Sodom is destroyed. No sex actually occurs and at all, but people think of it as a sort of a sex scene. So 2 angels in the city square. Now, what this is when God has decided to destroy Sodom, he decides to go down himself to see whether Sodom is as evil as he thinks it is. Not sure why God would need to go and check that out, but he goes down. Clearly, he's probably intending to rescue Lot. So 3 men had been talking to Abraham, but in this case, 2 of them, or 2 angels, the words are sort of used interchangeably, men and angels. 2 angels go down to Sodom, and they find themselves in the city square. So Lot, who is not from Sodom, of course, saw the angels, and he warned them against staying in the square. So we can ask ourselves, why did Lot do that? Well, he thought it was dangerous for them to be in the city square. And the Bible doesn't say why he thought that, but with the scene that's about to happen, we have some idea. So as soon as they were at his house, men from the city came out and surrounded the house and said to Lot, "Bring them out to us so that we can have sex with them." And Lot said, "Don't do this thing. I have 2 daughters you can have sex with. I'll bring them out and you can do what you want." So 2 virgin daughters. So he said, "The men have come here under the protection of my roof." And so we can ask ourselves, what is he protecting them from? Well, generally you would protect visitors from any harm, but in this case, we know what's going to come. So the Sodomites, we'll call them, because that's the name of the people that lived in Sodom, Sodomites, said, "This fella came here as a foreigner, and now he wants to play judge. Well, why should it matter if Lot is a foreigner, if he's trying to protect people living in his home? And what exactly is Lot judging? Well, he's judging the fact that these men have decided to ambush the foreigners who are living there. They wanted mob rule, and Lot is saying, I need to protect them. So their response to Lot is that we'll treat you worse than them. So let's think about this for a second. If they are going to just have sex, what is the bad treatment that might make Lot's potential treatment even worse? Having sex we think of as a good thing, not as a bad thing. Now, in this case, what would be bad about it if they're going to treat Lot worse than the angels? Well, obviously, it was because they were going to attack the angels and not because they were going to have just pleasurable sex with the angels. So Lot was pulled inside by the men, and I'm going to use men and angels interchangeably, just as the Bible does. So Lot was rescued by the men, and the men standing outside, the Sodomites, were all struck blind by the angels of the Lord. So then the men who are inside, the angels, tell Lot to leave because they are going to destroy the city. And Lot did not want to go, but the men took them, meaning Lot, his wife, and his two daughters, by the hand and led them out. And so apparently they left the sons-in-law. Lot said he couldn't run up the mountains where they were apparently instructed to go, and so he wanted to hide out at a nearby city, Zoar, and the angels allowed that. Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plain were then destroyed by fire and brimstone that came from the sky, and we know the famous story of Lot's wife who turned back and becomes a pillar of salt. So here's some initial thoughts about Sodom. God made up his mind to destroy Sodom before this famous scene about the men coming out to the house. Abram seems to have not been keen to be associated with Sodom, as he refused any gift. So Abram thought they were evil too. The men of Sodom expressed their displeasure at Lot's harboring the two strangers. I put that too lightly. It's more than express their displeasure. They determined that the mob was going to rule, and that the men there were going to be attacked. The men of Sodom were acting as a group. They were not acting as individuals. And Lot offered his virgin daughter so that the men could do as you like with them, which is, a very ugly thing for Lot to have done. It tells us something about the value of women in ancient Near Eastern society. So can we make any conclusions if we just consider the story of Sodom by itself? So I'm going to ask a tough question. Have you ever known of a situation where someone, male or female, was subjected to gang rape? And thinking about that situation, if you do, were the gang members male, female, or a combination? Mostly we know that gang members in a situation like that are male. Next, do you know any gay people? And do any of the gay people you know involve themselves in sexual violence or sexual assault? Does it involve a gang rape situation? And are you aware of any situation where a group of gay men rape someone? Now, you might think, well, if a group of men raped another man, they must be gay. But we'll think about that going forward, and you can think about that as well. Lastly, have you known someone who does not like foreigners come to live in their town or in their country? What kind of things does that person or people like that person do in reaction to the foreigners? Now, I ask these questions and we'll continue these, but likely you have known someone who does not like foreigners. Perhaps you have known of a situation of gang rape, but I think that we can begin to draw some conclusions just from Sodom that this is unlikely a group of gay men who wanted to have sex with these men. Let's keep going on these questions. What happens when foreigners host other foreigners? What do people say, and what do they do when that happens? So if some group of foreigners came to a town and they lived with other foreigners and then they brought more foreigners to live into the town, what is the reaction of people? In our country's history, what are some examples of how foreigners were treated badly? Well, I can say some. Catholics were treated quite badly. Chinese people were treated badly. Depending on your perspective of what happened in World War II, the Japanese people were treated badly. So we've had examples of foreigners treated badly. If I left out a group that you belong to or that you're aware of, I'm sorry about that. I just wanted to mention a few. What clues do we have in the Sodom story to make it clear that these are not gay men looking for sex partners? All right. Now we're going to establish more evidence here. So this is part 2. If you need a break, maybe take it here. This is going to take a bit and you might have to do some reading. Okay, let's continue. So this is the story of Gibeah. It is also called the story of the Levite and his concubine. This story begins in Judges 19 and continues through Judges 21, the end of the chapter. So it's a rather long story. If you haven't read it before, now would be the time to stop and read it, although I'm going to summarize how it's connected to our story of Sodom and Gomorrah. So I say here it's likely that you've never heard or read the story because it's really one of those stories that doesn't come up. People don't tend to preach about it. Occasionally they might mention it, but it certainly wasn't mentioned in Bible studies that I attended unless we did the whole book of Judges, and usually we didn't do that. We just picked out highlights. Only part of the story has any connection to Sodom and Gomorrah scene, but that part has implications for this study. All right, here's a synopsis. A Levite, so a man from the tribe of Levi, from the hill country of Ephraim, had a concubine. So that was a sort of a half-wife, let's call it. It's not a prime wife, but a woman that is taken by a man to live with him like a wife, and he would have to care for her. The concubine ran away back to her family in Bethlehem. We don't know why she ran away. 4 months later, the Levite went to persuade her to return. He took a servant and a donkey with him. After persuading her father, he managed to get the concubine to go back with him. There's a long story about that. They stopped in Gibeah of the Benjamites because it was one of the Israelite cities and they thought it would be safe. They didn't want to stop in a city of the Canaanites. Oops, scoot forward. Now that night, an old man from the hill country of Ephraim, so in other words, a man from the same place that the Levite was originally from, he happened to be living in Gibeah and he urged him to go into his house. That night, some of the men from the city surrounded the house and shouted to the old man, Bring out the man who came to your house so we can have sex with him. The old man wouldn't do it, but he offered his own virgin daughter as well as the Levite's concubine. So he was, it's bad enough that he would offer his own children, but he also offered the Levite's concubine and said, I will bring them out to you now, and you can use them and do to them whatever you wish. But as for this man, do not do such an outrageous thing. So it's not an outrageous thing to do what they wanted to do to a woman that was not their wife or concubine, but they could do that and it not be apparently outrageous. But as for this man, do not do such an outrageous thing. So now we'll read the details. These are posted on the next slide. So we're going to read these verses just so everybody can be together on this. But the men would not listen to him. So the man took his concubine and sent her outside to them. So the Levite did. They raped her and abused her throughout the night, and at dawn they let her go. At daybreak the woman went back to the house where her master was staying, fell down at the door, and lay there until daylight. When her master got up in the morning and opened the door of the house and stepped out to continue on his way, there lay his concubine, fallen in the doorway of the house, with her hands on the threshold. He said to her, Get up, let's go. But there was no answer. Then the man put her on his donkey and set out for home. When he reached home, he took a knife and cut up his concubine, limb by limb, into 12 parts, and sent them into all the areas of Israel. Everyone who saw it was saying to one another, Such a thing has never been seen or done, not since the day the Israelites came up out of Egypt. Just imagine, we must do something, so speak up. Then all Israel from Dan to Beersheba and from the land of Gilead came together as one and assembled before the Lord in Mizpah. The leaders of all the people of the tribes of Israel took their places in the assembly of God's people, 400,000 men armed with swords. The Benjamites heard that the Israelites had gone up to Mizpah. Then the Israelites said, Tell us how this awful thing happened. So the Levite, the husband of the murdered woman, said, I and my concubine came to Gibeah in Benjamin to spend the night. During the night, the men of Gibeah came after me and surrounded the house, intending to kill me. They raped my concubine, and she died. I took my concubine, cut her into pieces, and sent one piece to each region of Israel's inheritance, because they committed this lewd and outrageous act in Israel. Now all you Israelites, speak up and tell me what you have decided to do. Well, there was a war that ensued, and of course if 400,000 men armed with swords had come together and assembled, we can imagine there was going to be a war anyway. But we see in this passage that he said, they raped my concubine and she died. But right before that here it says, intending to kill me. So other translations just say, they intended to kill me. And they did kill the concubine. So let's find the similarities to the Sodom story. So you have a foreigner who invites foreigners into his home. The men of the city surround the home, demanding that the new foreigner be brought out for sex. The virgin daughters instead are offered, and the men of the city are not willing to accept the virgin daughters. Let's find the differences. So the new visitors. In Sodom, they were either angels, messengers of God, or the Lord himself. In Gibeah, they were the Levite and his concubine, otherwise unknown. So they were people. and the crime. In Sodom, it was prevented by the angels who blinded all the townsfolk so that Lot, his wife, and daughters could be escorted away. In Gibeah, though, the concubine was sent out, and the men had sex with and raped her until she was about to die. She was dead or near death. Anyway, she did die that night. In the aftermath to each story, in Sodom, the original foreigner escapes by the help of new foreigners. So Lot was rescued. Whereas in Sodom, the cities of the plain are destroyed by fire and brimstone. In Gibeah, the original foreigner, the Levite, has no more mention made of him. Excuse me, the original foreigner is the old man that hosted the Levite. There's no more mention made of him. And the new foreigner's concubine is left for dead and is hauled onto the Levite's home, where she is cut into pieces by the Levite and distributed to the tribes of Israel. A battle ensues. The Benjamites are conquered and their wives are taken by the men of the other tribes so as to preserve the tribe of the Benjamites. It's an interesting story, and I suggest you read it. That's right after this, at the end of Judges. What does the Levite say about the incident? So this is in chapter 20, verse 5. We've read it. During the night, the men of Gibeah came after me, surrounded the house, intending to kill me. They raped my concubine, and she died. So here we have a man who is living in ancient times. If not near the same time as Abraham and Lot, at least nearer to them than he is to us. Now, he experiences a very similar pursuit, entrapment, and threat. And his own interpretation is not one of homosexual sex, but of murder. And his proof is that they actually did rape his concubine to the point where she died. If I had to say what the whole point of this story is, it would be this second bullet point here. And if we can get that in our minds, that that was what was going on, then I think we have the appropriate interpretation of Sodom. What can we learn so far? Well, in ancient times, as in modern times, foreigners are often oppressed or treated with brutality. Now, Exodus 22:21 forbids this explicitly. You shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. The stories of Sodom and Gibeah show that in those times, gang rape of foreigners was at least a legend, if not reality. It would be like lynching that has occurred in the Western Hemisphere, particularly the United States. The result in Gibeah was the murder of the concubine, and God called these actions vile. We'll talk a bit about rape. Rape is not a subject we like, of course. Sexual assault and rape are not feel-good subjects. However, when we avoid talking about these subjects in detail, then the people who misinterpret the Bible, such as the story of Sodom, can do these things. They can spread hatred. They can spread hatred toward foreigners because they don't understand that this story is about rape of foreigners. They can divide families because they can talk and say evil things about gay people that don't actually happen, such as, accusing gay people of being the subject of this story and how God brought down fire and brimstone on them. So that can divide families. It can split churches, and we know that that has happened. It can cause further violence. If people think this story justifies killing gay people, then it can inflame some people into doing that type of violence. So, shall we say then that ignorance is not bliss? Here's some information on rape of males that I just got from various sources that are linked here. The first one I'll read is from Nicholas Groth's Men Who Rape, the Psychology of the Offender. It's a little bit old, but I think it's poignant. All sexual assault is an act of aggression, regardless of the gender or age of the victim or the assailant. Neither sexual desire nor sexual deprivation is the primary motivating force behind sexual assault. It is not about sexual gratification, but rather a sexual aggressor using someone else as a means of expressing their own power and control. That certainly happened in Sodom and in Gibeah, or was going to happen in Sodom at least, and did happen in Gibeah. Several of the legends, so the next one is from a book called Male Rape. Several of the, is from a television transcript of called Male Rape. There are several sources in that transcript, so I just listed the television station and the name. Several of the legends in Greek mythology involve abductions and sexual assaults of males by other males or gods. The rape of a defeated male enemy was considered the special right of the victorious soldier in some societies, and was a signal of the totality of the defeat. And last, from Stephen Donaldson papers. There was a widespread belief that a male who was sexually assaulted thus lost his manhood and could no longer be a warrior or ruler. Gang rape of a male was considered an ultimate form of punishment, and as such was known to the Romans as punishment for adultery, and the Persians and Iranians as punishment for violation of the sanctity of the harem. Gang rape is more common in cases involving male victims than those involving female victims. What that's saying is that rape itself it doesn't have the corollary, but rape itself is more common in cases involving female victims. But gang rape is more common in cases involving male victims. Also, multiple sexual acts are more likely to be demanded. Weapons are more likely to be displayed and used, and physical injury is more likely to occur, with the injuries that do occur being more serious than with injured female rape victims. Now that's just more likely. It does not mean in individual cases, but that's the statement. All right, so if Sodom and Gomorrah and the story of Gibeah are not about homosexual sex, then when did it start to be reinterpreted? In fact, let's skip down a few slides because I've got a list here at the end of all of the references to Sodom. So there are the ones early on in Genesis that we've talked about mostly, and then we get to just that Sodom was evil at that point. And I'm sorry about the color change here, but it's off the sheet, as it were. And then we get to the story of Sodom in 18 and 19. And then the other verses, are very similar to what we would read in Deuteronomy 32 here. For the vine is of the vine of Sodom, and the fields of Gomorrah, their grapes are grapes of gall, and their clusters are bitter. And except the Lord of hosts left us a very small remnant, we should be as Sodom, and we should have been like unto Gomorrah. So none of these Old Testament verses imply that sodomy was happening in Sodom, so that as we call sodomy. But let's look at what Ezekiel says. Behold, this was the iniquity of thy sister Sodom, pride, fullness of bread, and abundance of idleness was in her and in her daughters. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy. Now, I'm not sure when Ezekiel was written. Might be something to look up, but that says that was the iniquity of Sodom. And let's keep going. There's another one I'd like to read. Well, we've gotten into the New Testament by now, so here's something that Jesus says, "Verily I say unto you, it shall be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city. And thou, Capernaum, which art exalted to heaven, shalt be brought down to hell. For if the mighty works which had been done in thee had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until this day." So there is, and there's more just, about like that. It is not until we get to Jude, where verse 1:7, where we see something that makes us think that the idea of Sodom having sexual immorality would have been a thing. "So even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them in like manner, giving themselves over to fornication and going about after strange flesh, are set forth for an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire." I think I've got a slide that's got that bigger. So that's Jude 1:7. So now let's skip back to that slide. Reinterpretation of Sodom. So when did people start considering Sodomites to be homosexuals? Among the first to actually make the direct connection between homosexuality and sodomite sin were Philo of Alexandria, who lived around 25 BCE to 50 Common Era, a Jewish philosopher, and his preferences there, and we're going to read some from these. And then Josephus, from about 37 to 100 Common Era, he was commissioned by Roman authorities to write the history of the Jews, and it is called Antiquities of the Jews, and there's the reference of the place. Now, let's note that Abraham lived somewhere around 2000 BCE, approximately 2,000 years before Philo and Josephus. So there's a lot of time in 2,000 years to have a change in ideas. Let's see what Philo writes. Philo of Alexandria. "But God, having taken pity on mankind, as being a Savior and full of love for mankind, increased as far as possible the natural desire of men and women for connection together, for the sake of producing children, and detesting the unnatural and unlawful commerce of the people of Sodom, he extinguished it and destroyed those who were inclined to those things." So that's the whole statement. Philo contrasts the sexual desire of men and women together with the quote-unquote unnatural and unlawful commerce of the people of Sodom, and says the ones destroyed were inclined to those things. Now, these are not contrasts made in the Bible. Philo, a Hellenistic Jewish philosopher, might have invented this interpretation, or he might have been representing the view that was common in his day or common among scholars. I don't know. But there I've got a note of when he lived. Now let's go to Josephus. So, the Antiquities of the Jews by Flavius Josephus, chapter 11, how God overthrew the nation of the Sodomites out of his wrath against them for their sins. Okay, here's a quote. "And the angels came to the city of the Sodomites, and Lot entreated them to accept of a lodging with him, for he was a very generous and hospitable man, and one that had learned to imitate the goodness of Abraham. Now when the Sodomites saw the young men to be of beautiful countenances, and this to an extraordinary degree, and that they took up their lodgings with Lot, they resolved themselves to enjoy these beautiful boys by force and violence. And when Lot exhorted them to sobriety, and not to offer anything immodest to those strangers, but to have regard to their lodging in his house, and promised that if their inclinations could not be governed, he would expose his daughters to their lust, instead of these strangers, neither thus were they made ashamed. Okay, so the above quote shows that either Josephus or someone before him enhanced or changed the story with these details. The visitors to Sodom were called both messengers and angels. Josephus prefers to call them angels, so that's not really a change because one of the verses in the Bible does call them angels. Josephus, let me put a U.S. there. Josephus calls them young men. We don't have any indication that the angels that appeared young. Josephus, we don't have that from the Bible. Josephus says that they are, quote, of beautiful countenances, and this to an extraordinary degree. So not only did he make these out to be attractive men, but they were extraordinarily attractive men. Okay, I don't know where Josephus has gotten that, but that's really a stretch, and it's, of course, there's nothing like that in the original, and that would really only be necessary to say if he was trying to build the case that the men of Sodom were attracted to beautiful men and wanted to have sex with them, not that they were trying to surround the house and gang rape foreigners because another foreigner had brought them in and defended them. So it's really just describing two different stories. Josephus adds to what Lot says in Genesis thusly, if their inclinations could not be governed. So there's that word inclinations again, and he is associating inclinations as sort of saying same-sex orientation, the same way Philo did. So these show that by the time of Josephus, at least Josephus had come to regard the story as having to do with the sexual desire by the men of Sodom based on the attractiveness of the two angelic men who were there to rescue Lot before the destruction of the city. None of these details appear in the Bible. So now let's look at Jude. So Jude is written, around the same time as Josephus. So Jude 1:7. In a similar way, Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding towns gave themselves up to sexual immorality and perversion. They serve as an example of those who suffer the punishment of eternal fire. So this is the only verse in the Bible that makes a connection between Sodom and Gomorrah and sexual immorality and perversion. Jude was written after Philo and around the time of Josephus. It is likely that the opinions that Philo and Josephus wrote about had become widespread enough for Jude to himself become aware of them. My opinion is that Jude's representation of what was going on in Sodom and Gomorrah is at least questionable, if not incorrect, in the same way that what Philo and Josephus wrote was questionable. The reason is we don't know in Sodom and Gomorrah if there was any sexual immorality unless you want to classify gang rape as sexual immorality. And we don't know if there's any perversion unless you want to classify a preference toward gang rape of foreign men as the perversion. Because we've seen that this does not, what went on does not comport with how gay men act toward other men that they're interested in having sex with. It works as a gang rape scene, just as it was in Gibeah. I thought some people might be interested in knowing, how does this work in another religion, and since Islam is an Abrahamic religion, I wanted to give you a quote from the Quran. And so the Quran is written around 610 to 632 CE, so 500 or so years after the book of Jude or Josephus. So Surah 7 verses 80 through 81. And remember when Lot scolded the men of his people, saying, do you commit a shameful deed that no man has ever done before? You lust after men instead of women. You are certainly transgressors. So, again, this is not what happened in the original story. The problem was not that they were lusting after men. The problem was that they were going to rape them, and rape them to death. So Muhammad had this wrong as well. So thus it is to this day the view of the most conservative Islamic commentators that Muslims who are homosexual are the same as Sodomites. Or rather, we could say that they view Sodomites as the same as homosexuals. So what have we shown? Sodom and Gibeah are parallel stories in many ways. The men of Sodom intended to rape the angelic men, just as the men of Gibeah intended to rape the Levite. And the men of Gibeah did indeed rape to the point of death the Levite's concubine. Until the book of Jude, written 2,000 years after the scene, no biblical writer mentioned lust in connection with what happened in Sodom. All the other mentions mainly had to do with a lack of hospitality or treatment of foreigners, though this is an understatement when you say it's a lack of hospitality when they actually attack them. By the time of Jesus, Jewish philosophers and historians began thinking of Sodom as having to do with homosexual desire. They might have done this because homosexual sex was often considered normal within Greek culture, and they might have been trying to counter that by reinterpreting Sodom for a Jewish audience. Here is one of many additional resources that deal with this subject. I'll just have this link here. It deals with it in a very sort of terse way, but it is out there. And there are actually some quite good resources that you might want to look at if you're interested in looking at it more. And then we've seen this before at the bottom of this PowerPoint, and I will scroll through it again so that you can stop it as you want to read when you're looking at the video. These are all of the verses in the Bible that mention Sodom, and you can see for yourself which ones say anything about sexual desire and homosexuals. It is pretty obvious that the only one that does is Jude. All right, I appreciate you watching the video, and please feel free to send me any comments to my email address. If there's something that you think that I've said that needs correcting, or some other resource that you think that I should include, please let me know. Thank you.